We have a terrific speaker lined up to tell us more about this district, and that is Michael Yee. He earned his MA in history from the California State University San Marcos. He is a historian educator at the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. Initials are SDCHM. Previously, Michael served as the chair of the board for the SDCHM, as well as the conference chair of the 6th Chinese American Studies Conference, which was sponsored by the SDCHM at the University of San Diego in 1999. He also serves as a tour guide of the Asian Pacific Historic District in downtown San Diego. Michael is currently a board trustee of the Balboa Park Conservancy and a committee member of the Creative Catalyst Artist Program at the San Diego Foundation. Let's welcome now Michael Lee.
Hello, hi, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And I'm really thrilled to be able to speak with you all again. I can tell you are a close group, and we're really here to have fun for yourselves. And so I hope that you will get a lot out of this presentation. So this is an extension of a prior talk where I was talking about early San Diego Chinese history. And what I discovered as part of my research is that there's really this wonderful mixture of other histories and cultures within downtown San Diego. So let's see, I hope that you are using speaker mode. And so I do like to try to mix up the different media. So if you're on speaker mode, then I'm going to be the main focus, and then hopefully you'll see my face on the right hand side. So I'll be sharing screens, I'll be going to some different websites, and so please indulge me. I like to be able to jump between different media, so I will not have it completely full screen so I can control where the focus goes. And then if I have a little hiccup, then I have some questions in chat where you can also answer. So I have my colleague Elizabeth Cheney also on the line, and she's waving, so thank you, Elizabeth. And she can also respond to questions. If you want to multitask and type out some questions, she'll be able to respond to some, but we'll also then reconvene during the question and answer time. So let me switch over to.
Right. Depending on the content of the question, I can either respond to it via chat or present it to Michael verbally when we open up for questions.
Terrific. Okay, so I am going to switch over, and can somebody give a quick confirmation you see the starting page?
Yes, we see it.
Terrific. All right, and then I hope again that I'm on the right-hand side. I will try to maintain some eye contact. And so here we go. So this hour, I'm just going to go quickly and tie in with some of Old Chinatown, and the early part of the tour will cover some ground that I also talked about during the previous presentation. However, this talk will really focus more on the Japanese Nihonmachi, the Japanese neighborhood, the Filipino quarter, a little bit about the African-American Harlem of the West, as there is some overlap. But each of those three sections, I will defer to really the experts, and I will share with you who are the experts for those respective communities. But what this does is that this ties us in with the Asian Pacific Thematic Historic District. And then in honor of Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Asian District of today, a little bit of tourism piece, generate some excitement there. And then again, thank you for your patience as I switch between different media. So what I wanted to do, if you are tech savvy, I did want to highlight this. Feel free to take your smartphone, and if it understands this QR code, then open this up, because this tour is really designed to be taken as you're walking around the district. I will try to do some descriptions, and you will see the computer version demonstrated briefly, but I encourage you, take this tour really on a smartphone. You can walk around socially distant and appreciate the history and culture of the neighborhood. So there's the website, and then use the QR code. All right, so just really quickly, this was the topics from the previous presentation, so I won't go into that. And now I'm actually going to switch over to the tour here. Okay, so this was a digital project as part of my MA program. And so it uses a program called Story Map. And this map here is actually part of a master plan that the city of San Diego created to honor the Asian Pacific Islanders in San Diego. So this overlaps the Gaslamp Quarter, and it's 8 blocks of a thematic district. So you can see here that part of the plan is to have a Chinese American cultural center, which became the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. There's also a Filipino community organization that was here. Up along Market Street, then I will touch upon briefly the Harlem of the West, the Creole nightclub, and that's actually over here. And then if you're familiar with the downtown area, the Horton Grand Hotel is right in this space. And in the Gaslamp Quarter, the core street is 5th Avenue, and it runs up and down here. So what you would do if you're taking this tour on your own, you can use the scroll mouse, and it basically provides narrative descriptions and then pictures. So here is where the tour would start. And you can see up here in the upper left-hand corner, there's a map that kind of directs you to where you are placed within the block. And then along this side will be text. Look for, when you're taking the tour, this little comment here. There'll be 2 photos here. In this case, it's 2 photos. And down here at the bottom, you see these 2 little dots or this arrow on the right, and you would click over to see that there's additional photographs. Some of them current, some of them historic. In this case, this is a photo of 2 guarding stone lions, affectionately named Alex and Agnes. Alex was the founding executive director for the Chinese Historical Museum. So we named them fondly after him and his wife, Agnes. So I'm going to scroll on down. And for those of you who attended the previous talk, this is then a reminder. But for those of you who haven't, or who will be taking the tour on their own, you can see here Chinese fishing junks, coastal harbor moored off of San Diego. And then again, to give you this little bit of framework, and for those of you who are new, this is downtown San Diego in 1887, using these old insurance maps, the Sanborn insurance maps. And these are really actually very fascinating. The San Diego History Center has these. They're 3-foot high, leather-bound old maps. They're just wonderful to go browsing through. So here is, let's see, 5th Avenue, right up here. And then a private wharves existed at the time. Seaport Village is now in this location. The San Diego Convention Center is here. This is where the Chinese fishing shacks were initially built, and then Chinatown created right around here, 1st and 2nd Avenue. And this was then the soft spot where the Chinese were allowed to maintain their fishing shacks, and then where Chinatown grew. So I'm going to just scroll on down. So I'm not going to be doing all of the photos, but I did want to share with you, here's again some old maps. The Chinese Historical Museum is down here. And so you can see this is 3rd Avenue. There's this thing called a Joss House, which was the temple at the time. It's now actually the location of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association building, a very historic and important Chinese organization. But you can see here, down here, it says Chinese dwellings and stores. So they were all along through here, Chinese laundries. And so in the 1800s, laundries and were quite pervasive because that was one of the few businesses that the Chinese could own and operate. And as merchants under the Chinese Exclusion Act, that was one of the exceptions that allowed them to come to the United States. So I don't want to repeat a whole lot, but for those of you who would be looking at this, this is actual text of the Chinese Exclusion Act 1882. And it says here that this federal act, that it was the first federal legislation that addressed and targeted a nationality that they could not be citizens. So I'm going to scroll on down. So there's a little bit of that history. Now I did want to go into then some of the buildings that you will actually find on site. You see here that the map is slowly shifting as we're walking from 3rd and J, and we're walking up here. So this here is an ordinary building with newer buildings on each side. And then again, I want to highlight Quinn as one of the early leaders starting in the 1800s, 1884, and his leadership in bringing railroad work crews down to San Diego, helping to build the railroad lines going up and connecting up through Barstow, Temecula, Fallbrook, that allowed San Diego to boom once it was connected to the East Coast via a transcontinental line. And this again follows the 1869 completion of the Transcontinental Railroad that headed out of Sacramento. So you can see here, and then he was really one of those first families that got started here in San Diego. All right, so you'll pass by this building here, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. Here you can see it's decked out in ribbons. And then I also want to highlight another organization. This was originally called Native Sons of the Golden State, and they named their model after Native Sons of the Golden West. Native Sons of the Golden West was unfortunately at that time early on, it was a very nativist, anti-immigration organization. These Chinese Americans, having been born here and now in the 1920s, formed their own organization called Native Sons of the Golden State. It became the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. And then for those of you who may remember Wuqichang, so on 3rd Avenue, right in the middle of the block here, was the original home of Wuqichang. This building then had the fancy goods in the front, and this image is a little hard to tell. And then in the back of the store was where they had the grocery items, where the Chinese community could go shopping. So that's where they would sell the rice, the fresh vegetables, and they also made tofu in the back of the store. Wuqichang got started here in Chinatown on 3rd Avenue, and then it eventually expanded to 14th Street, and then had branch stores in Kearny Mesa, Chula Vista, and Oceanside. And unfortunately, they abruptly shut down right when Ranch 99 came in around the mid-1990s. So that is a store that we remember very fondly. And then here's an image of what Chinatown looked like, and you may recognize the picture. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was still very much of a Western town. So other parts of San Diego were getting built up. They had brick buildings as part of that San Diego boom. You know, this is when Hotel del Coronado was built in the about 1886. And San Diego jumped from just a few thousand people to up to 30,000 people. And then there was a crash. But during this time, you can see here that it's very much of just a regular, ordinary town, some brick buildings. Here's the CCBA building here. And this is actually the site of the second location for the Wuqichang building. That building, it's a one-story stucco building, still exists. All right, so I'm going to scroll on down. This building is still here, the Ying'an Association. One of the things that when I was giving tours, I really I kind of liked the variety of some of the different street settings because they were choosing to fly a flag of the People's Republic of China. And as a private organization, they were allowed to do that. And it added some character to the neighborhood. The Chinese Historical Museum, however, being an American nonprofit, we needed to remain politically neutral. So it was always, we invite both governments or neither government to different museum events. But this building has been around for almost 100 years. I'm going to now keep on scrolling down. You can see that we're walking down 3rd Avenue. This building I find particularly fascinating because it originally housed a Chinese grocery store, but as then the Chinese Exclusion Act kicked in 1882, Chinese laborers were not allowed to come to the United States. San Diego's Chinatown and San Diego's Chinese population really plummeted, to as low as a couple hundred from a high of 909 in 1880. So this particular building was built in 1913, but it housed then a number of African-American businesses. So it housed the Ideal Hotel, which was a segregated hotel for travelers of color. It also housed the Harlem Locker Club. So then later on, as the end of Broadway became one of the main piers that the Navy would moor at, the sailors needed to have a place to store their civilian clothes when they were on breaks. The Black sailors were not allowed to use the white locker clubs, so the Harlem Locker Club was such a location. So you can see here that here is Market Street and here's 3rd Avenue. Eventually, this actually reminds me that a number of years ago, Market Street was shortly named Martin Luther King Boulevard, and then it got changed back. And I remember wondering at the time why Market Street was chosen. Well, it's because the street actually had a long history. Creole Palace and the African-American community living really kind of intermixed in with Chinatown right along this stretch. I'll talk a little bit more about the Harlem of the West a little bit later on. So here's a bit of the district history. So as you're walking around here, you walk down 3rd Street and then Avenue and then start walking down back. This gives you that picture that I described previously. So we're actually walking down here. We've walked up to Market Street. We're coming down here. Then we're going to pass the Horton Grand Hotel and head this way. So I already shared a little bit about the history. In terms of what the city did, it actually established this official thematic historic district because there was a number of historic buildings. They call it a thematic district because it's not a strong concentration, and a lot of many of the buildings have been lost due to redevelopment, but they did try to make this honor and a master plan to honor the Asian Pacific Islander community. All right, so with that, I'm going to scroll down. So this, you'd be walking by if you're taking the tour of the Grand Hotel. And then you'll come across the Gaslamp Quarter Historical Foundation. They're a wonderful historical organization that is the protector and honors the history of the Gaslamp Quarter. And so they are still having tours, being active, and they've been heavily impacted by the pandemic. And so with that, there's their website right here, Gaslamp Foundation. So I'm going to stop here and now touch upon briefly the Japanese American history. I'm going to show a 2-minute video that is still San Diego based, but it gives you that history and background about the buildings that you're going to see as the remaining part of this tour. So I'm going to switch over, and somebody flag me if you cannot hear this. We had done some tests, and here we go. Okay. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the PowerPoint for a little bit. And so here, really, I want to honor the Japanese American Historical Society of San Diego and their book, Japanese Americans in San Diego. So it was done by that historical society and Professor Susan Hasegawa. And so if you really want to know more about the Japanese American community in San Diego, this is the place to go. So we already showed this video. And so what I'd like to do is, if I, during the next pause, or if you even want to multi-task for a little bit, you can type into the chat. If you had visited a little Tokyo or Japantown, there's at least, 3 here in California. And if so, where and what was your experience? If no, go ahead and type in not yet, or you can just remain silent. Then we'll have a bunch of chat conversations in the chat session. So I'll go back through during the Q&A. So this will be part of the gathering information. And I personally find it fascinating because I'm oftentimes able to back onto that. So before we get back into the Asian Pacific Historic District walking tour, I did want to highlight that here are some background that the Japanese actually came to San Diego in the late 1880s. So, picture this, that the Chinese Exclusion Act is really kicking in. Chinese laborers are really not being allowed to be in the United States, but California, San Diego, it really needed to have manual laborers to reclaim farmland, to build out dikes and do heavy construction, as well as you can see, working on the railroads. So the Japanese were here in San Diego, becoming very successful in terms of being farmers. There were farms in Mission Valley, Pacific Beach, Chula Vista, and North County. In Vista, there's a Vista Buddhist temple. So the Japanese then were really filling that labor gap left with the Chinese exclusion. And on the right-hand side, again, from the Japanese Americans in San Diego book, you can see here that there were merchants who were setting up to provide goods and services for the Japanese workers. And then this photo here, you will actually, if you stood across the street from the Pacific Hotel, this is the Pacific Hotel, you'd be able to basically see this exact image. Along this right-hand side, there was a barber and bath, the Hironaka Barber and Bath right here. And then going down Fifth Avenue. So here's Fifth Avenue. There were stores like the Iwata Billiards and the Kawasaki grocery store. And then I do want to touch on that this photo includes the Poston internment camp, where most of the residents in San Diego went to. They went to the Santa Fe Railroad Station, got on, and then were shipped to the Santa Anita racetrack, where they were held for a few months in the house, in whatever housing was available, or the stables. So, we're not talking about a clean environment, before Poston was built and they were sent out to Poston. I did want to highlight there, you can see a couple of guard towers. So there's this guard tower here. This is the shadow of a guard tower. So if there's any question about were these internment camps, at the time, actually the San Diego City Council called them concentration camps. These were, unpleasant places. So with that, I'm going to set up going back here. So here is now the Japanese community. And you can see here's the building, the Pacific Hotel. It's now a Thai restaurant. So this is where the Japanese businesses and really the central hub of the Japanese community was. Most of the Japanese actually lived elsewhere. They were working in agriculture, And the Japanese were actually very successful in terms of farmers until around 1913. There was an alien land that California passed that restricted and eliminated a lot of Japanese ownership of farms. And so that contributed to the decline of the Japanese community in terms of the farming. And let's see. And then here, I do want to highlight that, let's see, okay, right down here. So I highlighted a little bit of yellow. So one of the things that I think is important to point out is that this is the actual order that was posted where all persons of Japanese ancestry need to leave the Western United States. Yellow highlighted this little statement here, both alien and non-alien. So actually, out of the 120,000 people who had to leave, the majority were American citizens and children, and they were citizens. However, the statement here that says alien and non-alien, well, it just would look bad to say whether you're an alien or a citizen. So the term non-alien was used in the language to force them to leave. And the impact of the internment was, quite substantial because they only had a few days to take care of their homes and their businesses. A lot of families just completely lost their property if they were not able to find somebody to take care of their business or their home. So I'm going to scroll on here. So this is then also part of the Japanese Nihon Machi. Down here on the right, there was a tofu bakery. So it was listed in the directory as a bakery because a tofu shop was made every single day. It wasn't those little refrigerated cubes that you get in the grocery store. It was made out of big sheets, let's say 2 feet by 2 feet, and they would make it and sell it fresh. And so there was one story of the family who opened up this shop, bought some tofu making equipment. The previous owners, the previous holders didn't tell them how to actually make a commercial grade tofu. So they went through about 100 different recipes trying to figure out how to do that. But fortunately, they were able to open up their shop, and they were very successful up until 1941 when World War II hit. So you can see here that this region area really intermixes then the old Chinatown and the Japanese Nihon Machi. So for the general public, there's virtually no reference of the Nihon Machi, but the general public in San Diego knew this area as Chinatown, and they labeled that as such in the newspapers. But here is an ad for then the Nanking Cafe. This was a Thai restaurant for many years. And you can see here that chop suey was one of those favorite dishes at the time in the 1920s and 1930s. And that was considered very exotic. You can see here that this was then China was viewed as being kind of still a strange and exotic location, but a little bit less demeaning and insulting from the earliest days of the Chinese exclusion. So with that, I'm going to jump over and now touch upon the Filipino-American experience. And let's see, here we go. All right, so I'm going to show a video that AARP did in conjunction, and it's broader than just the Asia Pacific Historic District downtown, but I think it gives you a really good picture of the overall Filipino-American story. So we'll watch about 6 minutes of this.
A Filipino-American story. Before the founding of America, even before the settlement of Jamestown, there were Filipinos in what is now known as the continental United States. Throughout history, Filipino Americans have led movements, confronted injustices, and have created world-shaking ideas. They disrupt. So why is their history largely untold? We must tell them to unsettle the pages of U.S. history. They reveal who we are as Americans. People from the Philippines, which was under Spain, first landed in California as part of the Spanish galleons. On future sailings, many jumped ship to form settlements in what would be known as Louisiana. It is a fact. Filipino Americans have been in the United States for centuries. In 1898, the United States entered into war against Spain and took possession of the Philippines, paying Spain $20 million. To rationalize colonization, American officials referred to this as benevolent assimilation, claiming to protect Filipinos' rights and liberties. But the Filipino people, who were already fighting for independence from Spain, resisted U.S. colonization. This was known as the Philippine-American War. Fought with extreme violence, General Jacob H. Smith notoriously ordered his soldiers to kill every Filipino boy over 10 years old. Many Americans opposed this, including Mark Twain and the African-American Buffalo Soldiers who were sent to the Philippines for battle. Somehow, America needed to justify this war. They even transported some Filipinos to the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair for display. Erased from our history, the Forgotten War became the catalyst of Filipino migration to the U.S. Because of the Philippines' colonial status, the people became a major source of cheap labor. And so, Filipinos migrated to Hawaii as early as 1906 to work in sugar plantations. By the 1920s, many Filipino laborers also came to the West Coast to become a driving force behind America's agricultural industry. But many of these labor migrants were met with racial hostility. White Americans accused Filipino men of stealing their jobs and women. Filipinos faced down mobs, beatings, and murder, yet they resisted this oppression. Filipino towns such as Stockton's Little Manila were formed to serve as safe havens up and down the West Coast. Labor strikes demanded fair wages and working conditions. Under pressure, Congress greatly restricted the migration of Filipinos and promised independence for the Philippines. Through it all, Filipinos continued to persevere. World War II was a time of great upheaval for both the Philippines and Filipino Americans. Japan bombed American bases in the Pacific, at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines, prompting the U.S. to enter the war. As a colony, the Philippines allied with America. President Roosevelt established the United States Armed Forces in the Far East to enlist nearly 250,000 Filipinos into the U.S. Armed Forces, a decisive move that helped win the Pacific Theater. After the war, America granted independence to the Philippines. Filipinos who joined the armed forces in the U.S. gained the right to citizenship. Filipino veterans in the Philippines were promised citizenship as well and military benefits. However, the passing of the 1946 Rescission Act broke that promise for many of those veterans. American military bases remained in the Philippines recruiting Filipinos. At one point, there were more Filipinos in the U.S. Navy than the Philippine Navy. Many of these Navy sailors came to America. Filipino women married to U.S. military men also migrated to the U.S. These women raised families, bought land, and created communities. They built the next generation of Filipino Americans. In 1965, an important legislation greatly expanded immigration quotas. By 1970, the Filipino population had ballooned. In a decade, it had more than doubled. Many of these new immigrants were women and professionals. In the 60s, Filipino Americans fought for equality alongside Black Power and Chicano movements. In California, Larry Itliong, Philip Veracruz, and other organizers led a strike against grape businesses. Filipinos convinced Cesar Chavez and his association to join the strike. Filipinos started the 1965 Delano Grape Strike, and together with Latinos, they had one of the most successful strikes against agribusiness in history. The younger generation were also in revolt. San Francisco State University and UC Berkeley students, including young Filipino Americans, led a strike that established ethnic studies. Many other groups organized to serve the Filipino American community. There are now over 4 million Filipinos in the United States. FONS, the Filipino American National Historical Society, tells the stories of the Filipino American experience. Established in 1982 by Dorothy Ligo Cordova and Fred Cordova, FONS saw the value in documenting Filipino American history, honoring October as Filipino American History Month. And why wouldn't they? Filipino Americans persevere for a just and prosperous society no matter the stakes. Whether they excel in public service, head the Filipino food movement, inspire us as sports heroes and as creative artists.
So with that, I'm going to stop, and one of the things that I'm amazed at is certain entertainers like Bruno Mars are closely connected with the Filipino American community. So with that, I am going to switch back to now this PowerPoint, and let me know in the chat if you are not seeing a PowerPoint slide, because I'm again jumping between media. I want to honor and recognize this particular organization, the Filipino American National Historical Society, the San Diego chapter. And this particular book is where they are the experts about the Filipino American community and the history here in San Diego. So I touch upon it a little bit as we're walking through the district, but I want to honor it and honor their book here. So we saw here this particular video about the Filipino American story. And then so at this time, while I'm doing a swap, if you have visited a community with a large Filipino American community, let us know where it was and what your experience was. And I'd like to take a look at it during the Q&A. So I'm going to switch to now. Back to our regularly scheduled program here. So you saw during that video that there was a long history of the United States and Philippine connections, including then the Philippines being a territory of the United States. And one of the things that FONS likes to really highlight in San Diego, right around 1903, because the Philippines was a United States protectorate, and they were not aliens, they were not citizens, but they were US nationals. And so a group of students came from the Philippines to study at San Diego State College and the local high schools, and they were pensionados. So that was the first connection of the Filipinos coming to San Diego to be educated so that they could then return to the Philippines and help with the administration and leadership in the Philippines. So this is one of then the buildings that was really closely tied with the Filipino community. It's the Manila Cafe. And so you can see here, it kind of has some Asian influences. Earlier in the Asia Pacific Historic District's history, this was a Chinese restaurant upstairs. And so on a tour of the Japanese Nihon Machi by the society, an old timer shared that for a Japanese wedding, they would go down the street to a Japanese hairdresser. The Buddhist temple was also about a block away in a location that does no longer exist, but the Buddhist temple has moved and does still exist off of Market Street. They would get married there. They would come up here to the Chinese restaurant, and that's where they would have the reception. So you can see here that the Chinese community and Japanese really kind of interacted because neither community could go to a regular restaurant during this time of segregation in the 1920s and 1930s when they were all living down here. I did want to then highlight, here's a Lincoln Hotel. This is where the Philippine Library and Museum existed for many years, 20 years, and they had a wonderful museum in the basement, but I've been told that it has since closed. One of the things then that I think is really quite remarkable is that, so the pensionados were here, then Filipino laborers came because now the Chinese and Japanese laborers were being restricted. And so they were working around the county in the farms and in agriculture. And most lived actually closer to 14th Street and Broadway. So not as many were living in downtown San Diego, but they also formed businesses. And one of the businesses that was really a strength for them was in having these dance halls, as well as things like billiard halls, barbershops, and but they also were very strong in music. So you could see here that this photo, Harry and his band with a white lead singer, was one of the bands that provided entertainment for the laborers. And then as a part of that, so San Diego really did not like having these dance halls. So it tried to, the city government tried to shut down some of these dance halls. Well, the dance hall owners then pivoted and they said, okay, we're offering dance instruction. So you can see here that there's a couple of dance halls. There's a Rizal dance hall, and then there's the Manila dance hall. And so they were pivoting, hiring white and Mexican women to be dance partners for the Filipino laborers. They would pay 10 to 15 cents for a short 1-minute dance. And that was part of the recreation scene. All right, so I'm going to now keep on going. Quan Main is a well-known merchant. And I'm going to now show how multi-ethnic this neighborhood was, because this is where the Sun Cafe existed. This is on Market Street. It was a Japanese restaurant owned by the Obayashis. They started with a shooting gallery, started selling food and soups, and then that business turned out to be so successful that they really turned it into their own restaurant. This is the current photo of the building. You can see here they've retained the historic character of the Sun Cafe, but now there's a bar, Funky Garcia's, located in it. And this was taken during the pandemic. Did want to highlight then, during this time, there was still the mixture between the African American community and the Chinese and Japanese communities. So you may recall the movie Green Book, which was a story during the time when African American travelers needed to know where was safe for them to visit in terms of businesses. So the Green Book was created as a directory that listed the safe places. And so you could see here in this mid-1930s issue that the Sun Cafe was one of the places that they could go to in San Diego. And now the movie itself, if you watch it, it's a fabulous movie, but it's a combination of, historical, segregation, a talented musician, but also there's a love story all tied up into it. So, when you watch movies that have a basis in history, a lot of times, the storyline is tilted in such a way to make an interesting story. So you do need to separate between what is actual history and what is some creative license. So I am going to keep on going. So here is where the Harlem of the West comes in. So you can see here that the map is shifted again. I talked a little bit about the Creole Palace, and I'll show you a picture really quickly. And this is where the tour in terms of the website is going to stop. But I did want to highlight that here they're advertising that you can get fabulous, and this was really, a known place along the West Coast. Entertainers such as Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday performed here, and this was the heart of what they call Harlem of the West, really built around the Creole Palace. So with that, I'm going to touch upon. So here's a couple of photos about the Filipino presence. I did want to highlight then, here's the photo of the Creole Palace. So along Market Street, there's a little marker on a modern building right here that recognizes the Creole Palace. But this is actually what it looked like. You know, there's a book, there's a report and article, African Americans in Historic Preservation by Professor Leland Saito at the San Diego History Center. You can look it up online. And this photo is from that particular article. So you can see here that it was really a location for African American entertainers for over 30 years. So I want to bring us to the present just really quickly, because if you're wondering, well, hey, what's going on? I wanted to highlight both the Japanese and Filipino communities because they are very pervasive here in San Diego. You could see here 407,000 Asian Americans, 30,000 the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders in terms of the population here in San Diego. So it's actually, you know, quite significant. And just in terms of names, so you may have noticed there's many different labels that are coming out, and it's still evolving. There's Asian American, there's Asian Pacific Islander, there's Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander is being disaggregated statistics wise because the needs of some of that community, with big communities of, let's say, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander in Oceanside, and Cal State San Marcos hosts the Chamorro Festival, which is the Guamania from Guam. And so you can see here that along here in Carmel Valley, Peñasquitas, this is where the Filipino community and the Asian community exist. And then down here in Chula Vista. So I'm going to highlight really quickly. You can see here's some statistics that show really the populations and some of the percentages, 18 to 20%, and then how they break it out among Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. I wanted to show this slide because it shows really all the different countries with all the different languages living here in San Diego, which I think really provides a very rich aspect to San Diego. And for our last slide, I'm going to all right. I'm going to show this just a minute here.
Found in the heart of San Diego, the Convoy District has a culture unlike any other, celebrating multiple elements of the Asian and Asian American experience. Filled with an eclectic array of hidden culinary gems, from Korean barbecue to ramen to sushi and more, Convoy also showcases some of the city's best in local craft beers as well as the most inventive craft cocktails. Beyond food and drink, Convoy also provides unique nightlife opportunities with eye-catching dessert shops, karaoke bars, and more. It's easy to see why so many San Diego residents and visitors come here to see, to eat, and to experience all this area has to offer. Hi, I'm Kent Lee, Executive Director of Pacific Arts Movement, presenter of the San Diego Asian Film Festival. Join me today on this amazing tour of the Convoy District here in San Diego. If I could describe Convoy in one word, it would be vibrant, representing the broad range of cultures, people, and definitely vibrant food. The biggest challenge you'll find when visiting Convoy isn't just deciding what to eat. They have something for everyone. If you're looking for the best ramen, if you're looking for the best dessert shops, if you're looking for that night out, this is the place to go. If you're looking for dumplings, you've got to visit Dumpling Inn, where you can find their famous xiaolong baos. These dumplings are unique because they're actually filled with soup. For those who are looking to stay home and cook, Zion Market on the north side of Convoy is where you go to find all the Asian ingredients you need. If I've got one tip, it's to save room for dessert. There's nothing my 2-year-old loves more than ice cream. At Bing House, you can find Thai-style rolled ice cream with a bunch of unique toppings. You won't want to miss this tasty treat. There's so much more to Convoy than just finding great things to eat. Within Common Theory Public House, you'll find...
Okay. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing just really briefly and say, so that I wanted to leave enough time for us to be able to, answer questions in honor of the month then I wanted to leave a little bit of excitement and share with you where the current Asian district is. And the city has actually declared that as an official cultural district of San Diego. And so, really with that, I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. We have 6 minutes or so to chit chat and take a look at any questions that you have. So again, thank you so much for your time.
Michael, thank you so much for this wonderful tour. I learned so much. I think I'm going to go back and watch it a second time just to get it all down. But I want to open it up to our members for questions or comments. Feel free to either raise your hand electronically or just jump right in. We have a small enough group.